WESTON. But I was also amazed to find that the previous government had done it as well. Police officers, in my experience, have many endearing features. Political nous isn't one of them. I wouldn't have had, if I'd been I must declare an interest here. I know Peter Ryan because I've been studying the National Party for a long time. And always during state elections, I go on the road, travelling around rural Victoria, trying to get the pulse. If I'd known he was a police officer, I would have told him he was a bloody fool. And sack him.
What is it that Tristan Weston did that was so wrong?
It appears, and we still haven't got to the final bottom of it, there have been more inquiries and reports than you can shake a stick at, and it still seems to never go away. It seems as though he was running an undermining operation against Simon Overland from inside Peter Ryan's office. And Peter Ryan denies that he knew about it. Now, the commentator is split two ways on that. They either believe Peter Ryan or they don't.
Do you have a view on whether...
Yes, I do believe him, because I think in this day and age, a person working in a minister's office simply has to walk out onto the balcony, get on his mobile phone and get up to anything he wants, and there is no way that Ryan would know about it. There was also another reason why Ryan shouldn't have employed this bloke, or shouldn't have employed anybody. As Ryan said, he had a quite close-knit team around him that he built up when he was leader of the opposition, and there was a strong bond of trust amongst them. And this outsider came in and they immediately trusted him. And I think he betrayed their trust.
Okay. So they took a hit on the Overland affair.
Yes.
It seemed to me as an observer watching the way the Baillieu government was tracking in its first few months that it was a do very little government. You know, there was a strong sense about it that it wasn't achieving very much. The question I have is that the case? And if it was it a deliberate strategy, or was it just a matter of circumstance that had led to that?
I think it was a bit of both. Remember, Ted Baillieu is not Mr. Dynamism. The contrast between him and Ryan is startling. Ted Baillieu, as people said in opposition, was so laid back he was almost comatose. But remember, why did that government come into office? Now, it was a surprising victory. It's a very narrow victory, of course. It's a one-seat victory, which has been completely forgotten. Everybody looks to Canberra and says, look how precarious the situation of the government is. In fact, Gillard is in much stronger numbers situation than Baillieu is.
So the numbers in Victoria are 45, 43, giving them a one-seat majority by virtue of having the Speaker.
That's right. So I think, and why did they win? I think the general consensus was that two reasons. One is that the Labor government had been there for quite some time. And secondly, that they dropped the ball on service delivery, particularly transport. And I think what this government is doing, though I detect a little change at the moment, which I might get into, was simply running a very service-centric delivery government. Very contrast, of course, to the previous coalition government in Victoria, which was dominated by Jeff Kennett, which was a highly ideological government. It was probably the most ideological state government we've seen in Australia since the Second World War.
Well, I mean, this is what I find interesting too, because we know that Baillieu is close to Kennett, and yet you couldn't find two more different forms of government. Is what's happening in Victoria now a reaction to the hatred that built up for Kennett all those years ago? Are they deliberately going about things differently?
Yes, I think they are, and they have a template to learn from this. They think that the Bracks-Brumby government learnt from the Kane-Kerner government. That the Kane-Kerner government was chaotic and the Bracks-Brumby government was steady state. Now, history doesn't bear that out. I mean, the Kennett government, the Kerner government was, quote, chaotic for the last 18 months of its term, whereas that government had been there for 10 years. But that's the message they've taken, and of course Kennett was a highly activist premier, and of course everybody at the time thought that the Kennett government was going to go on almost forever, that Kennett would at some point choose the date of his retirement, get a statue outside the new Treasury building for being in power for so long, and of course they got beaten in a shock result. That really was a shock result. We know why it happened. It was the revenge of the regionals. regional Victoria just said we've had enough of this and threw him out.
All right, so it sounds like what you're saying is that the Overland affair is the biggest mistake so far.
Yes, I think that's pretty true. Not so much just about the details of the Overland affair, but I think it's knocked them off the ball.
Okay. What are the other mistakes they've made?
I don't think they've really made a great deal of mistakes. I mean, they've done some silly things like letting cows back into the national park, but remember that's just a payoff to the national park. I mean, what we've got to realise about this government is this is a genuine coalition. Baillieu, who, as we know, is a small L Liberal, cannot ignore the National Party because there is numbers in both houses of Parliament. In the Kennett government, which was technically a coalition, Kennett could and did ignore the National Party because he didn't need them in either house. The Liberals had a majority in their own right. He was not the architect of the coalition agreement. It was stitched up in 1990 when he'd been thrown out of the leadership. He didn't like it, but there was nothing he could do with it because it was a legal document. But what he did do was simply ignore the National Party. And I think that's where there's been the, if you might say, the second tier of silliness is pandering to the National Party on issues that are not going to sing well in the eastern and southern suburbs of Melbourne. And to persist with it. I mean, they, as you know, they let cattle grazing back into the national park. They said that was literally a reward because a lot of primary industry groups in the seat of Gippsland East put a lot of money and a lot of effort into beating the last independent.
You're talking about Craig Ingram.
And replaced him with the National in a very big swing. So they've got debts. But I think having done it, then got into trouble, they haven't left it alone. They keep coming back to it. And every time they do it, of course, the federal minister knocks them on the head.
I should say I'll be opening this to the floor in a few minutes. There's just a few more questions I want to ask. So think of the questions you'd like to ask Brian. It seems they've made what appear to me to be mistakes over several environmental issues. For some reason, all these things start with C. There was cattle, then there was coal, and they're opening up the floodgates on exporting coal. There's the carbon emission reduction targets that I think were thrown out, and there's greater access to coal seam gas. Are these mistakes or are these deliberate?
Well, we're going to find out whether they're mistakes. I think the reason why they're happening is, if you notice, there's one thing that links all those things together, and that is they can be seen as pro-business. Now, Baillieu was copping criticism from particularly what I might call the more political employer organisations for being too soft on unions and not being nice enough to us.
So by us, can you clarify that?
Yeah, business groups. So what do? They keeled over the cops, of course, on their pay rise. I mean, it constantly amazes me that Victorian governments, be they Liberal or Labor, simply are unrealistic about the Police Association. They think the Police Association is all powerful. The Police Association has influence because the government allows it to have influence. If they just said to them, go away, it doesn't matter. Most police officers are rusted on coalition voters. Not all, but most. They're not electorally significant. The government will not ignore them. They pander to them. But then, of course, they stacked on a blue with the nurses. They dragged it out. They were always going to lose that. State governments never win industrial disputes against nurses because nurses are so well regarded in the community. Go and have a look at the ratings for professions on ethics and honesty. The nurses are always up in the top few. Journalists, I fear to say, are always down in the last three with car salesmen and real estate. Real estate agents. Yes, university lecturers, however, do a little bit better than that. We're in the top rankings, but not as high as nurses.
Not quite deserved, but anyway.
And what happens at the end of it? That nurses' dispute basically settled around the issue, roundabout giving and taking that could have been done months ago. Why did they do it? Send a message. But now they've got themselves into trouble over teachers. That will be on again. Prison officers, it'll go. Because remember, Baillieu made some fairly outlandish promises before the election, like he wanted Victorian teachers to be the best paid in the country. Well, they're asking, let's see it. So I think
I've asked you about those environmental ones. Do you know whether they're mistakes in or not?
we're not sure. They could look to be. I think in the long run they're mistakes. I think taking that sort of head in the sand attitude is probably not going to cut the mustard down the way. But remember, even though Baillieu has cut the 24-hour media spin to some extent, a fair bit actually, state governments are always looking to the next election and not beyond it.
Well, that's their advantage, isn't it? It's still 2.5 years old.
That's right.
All right, I'm going to open up to the floor. Now, I've deliberately not taken the course of reading out people's questions, and we'll talk about that in a moment if you want. But we'll open it up to you. Are there any questions you'd like to ask?
Can I just ask a quick one? Are you kind of implying that the National Party is the tail wagging the Liberal Party dog?
I think it has more influence than its numerical numbers would show. It's only got 10 members in the lower house and 3 in the upper house. I think a lot of it is Ryan himself. Remember, the National Party was in a pretty sorry state at the end of the Kennett government because Kennett had just worked them over. He'd given them all the unpopular portfolios. Remember, the person who had to sell council amalgamations out in rural and regional Victoria, and as well as in Melbourne, was a National Party minister who retired at the end of it. Basically said, I can't put up with any more of this, because council amalgamations was just toxic in regional Victoria. So the National Party leader resigned almost immediately after the 1999 election, whereupon the National Party lost the seat to Labor. They won it back, but it was a shock loss. And then Ryan got the job, and really he put in a lot of effort building that party up again, because there were people up around 99 saying this is the end of the National Party in Victoria. Now, of course, the problem with that is that Peter Ryan is over 60 years of age. He's not alone in that. He can't go on forever. Don't make the mistake the Liberals made with Kennett. They invested far too much of their political capital in him. When he went, it fell apart. The National Party has got to be very careful that it doesn't do that. They've got to be building other people. But I think they are more influential than their numbers suggest, A, because their numbers are essential, and B, because Ryan's a bit of a go-getter.
Okay, who's next? Yeah.
Hi, first of all I just want to say thank you for talking to us this afternoon. The government recently announced that they're slashing their carbon reduction target down from 20% to 5%, in line with the federal government's target. And they also announced recently that they're opening up allocations for the Trove brown coal. Now, I just wanted to get your opinion on this. Do you think that there's a connection between the two, considering the state of the Victorian economy at the moment?
Yes, I'm sure there is. I mean, I think it is short-termism, as I said, but I think they are connected. I think that the Victorian economy isn't particularly brilliant, but I mean, what I mean by that is it's not the growth economy, but I mean, let's be realistic here. We're going through a mining boom, and the minerals are in Western Australia and Queensland, so it's not surprising that those two states are quite booming. We know what will happen to them. They will bust. We have never had a mining boom in this country that hasn't been followed by a bust. So they want to be very careful, those two states, because when it busts, it'll go badly. Victoria, of course, has still been wrestling, and it's been wrestling with it for a long time, is the decline of the manufacturing industry. I mean, 40% of manufacturing jobs that have been lost in Australia were Victorian jobs. And it doesn't seem as though that's going to reverse. This is why Victoria, remember, got so badly hit by the recession that Paul Keating gave them back in 1991, the recession we had to have. The reason Victoria went down so badly is that Victoria had so much of its capital invested in the very industries that the recession hit hardest. And Victoria went down very quickly, as took the Kerr government, or the Kane and Kerr governments with it. The irony was, by the time Kennett had come to power in late 1992, the economy was back up to the position it had been in July 1990 when it started to fall. So it went down quick and deep, came out fast and steep. But, you know, government, if you're the government that gets caught in that, you go. That's what happened.
Another question?